Inevitably in this life, we are subject to emotions. Some of the emotions are pleasant. There's friendliness, love, compassion, gratitude, joy, delight. And some of the emotions are unpleasant. We are subject to anger, fear, sadness, hurt, frustration, jealousy, embarrassment, shame, guilt, impatience. When we encounter the difficult emotions, that is to say, the unpleasant emotions, our tendency is to become preoccupied with two things. One is figuring out what's going on, and the other is doing something about what's going on. And this is completely legitimate. Our thinking mind has a job to do, which is consider situations, consider circumstances, figure out, is it them, is it me, why am I going through this, what caused this situation? That's quite legitimate. And then we have to do things. We have to express ourselves, take actions, say things. So whenever we encounter these negative or difficult emotions, immediately we're drawn into the aspect of figuring things out and dealing with the circumstance. The problem is twofold. The first is that often the difficult emotion gets in the way of clear thinking and clear action. Because a difficult emotion will usually turn into suffering. It will turn into a problem, maybe big, maybe small. And suffering distorts our behavior. It distorts our perception, and it makes it difficult for us to think. So often when we encounter a difficult emotion, we experience a lot of confusion. So our thinking process is less than optimal. And therefore, the actions that we're likely to take may be less than optimal. That's the first problem. The second problem is that our tendency is to get involved only in a consideration of the circumstances and what we should do about them. And we don't put any of our time and energy, typically, into using the difficult emotion as an opportunity for learning, for gaining insight, for purification of consciousness, and for radical spiritual growth. What this series is about is developing some understanding concerning the nature of difficult emotions, and also developing some skills so that when the difficult emotions come up, we can use them, learn from them in a way that we will grow radically. Radically means at the root, at the very core of our being, something will grow and change. So that, first of all, our experience of suffering will diminish over the months and years of our life. And secondly, that we will eventually be able to experience difficult emotions as none other than the spiritual perfection of the moment. Now, I realize that that is an extremely radical claim, an audacious claim. How can something like anger, fear, sadness, embarrassment be even remotely described as the spiritual perfection of the moment? Well, since inevitably we are going to be subject to these difficult emotions, it behooves us to understand that in addition to taking care of what causes the difficult emotion, taking care of the circumstance, we as human beings have a second degree of freedom, you might say, a second option. We can also learn how to have a complete experience of that difficult emotion. Now, complete experience is an awesome concept. If I were to say the word complete experience, most people would think that implies maybe an intense experience or that one expressed oneself externally in an unblocked way. That's not what I mean by a complete experience. When we have a complete experience, we are so involved in the activity of the experience that we have no time left to fixate that activity into a thing. And so the experience actually becomes an energy wave. And that energy wave links us, on one hand, to our spiritual source, and on the other hand, to the whole universe. Now, I realize that this is a shocking claim, an audacious claim, because it goes against our ordinary experience. Most people can't imagine how something like anger, fear, or sadness could become an energy wave that linked and united us to our spiritual source. And the purpose of this talk is to try to explain step by step how that can be. In order to make this tangible, let's take an example. You have a difficult interaction with someone with whom you have a significant relationship. Big argument, maybe a breakup. The big argument, the breakup, the disagreement is the circumstance. In response to that, you find that there arises within you a quality of sensation behind your eyes that is a sadness quality. And from behind your eyes, that sadness quality spreads and fills your whole body. You also notice that there's some fear involved in this situation. Fear of being alone, fear of being abandoned. And you may notice that the fear feels different from the sadness in terms of its quality, and also it has a different distribution in the body. Maybe the fear has a center in your abdomen. And likewise, when you look carefully, you see from there it spreads to the rest of the body. And maybe there's some anger. The anger feels different from the sadness, feels different from the fear. And the anger perhaps is in your arms. And from there spreads to the rest of your body. And perhaps there's some embarrassment, some sense of shame or humiliation in this situation. And you notice that that doesn't have any particular center. It's evenly distributed throughout your whole body. And you may notice that your whole body is shaking physically. And associated with that shakiness is another quality of sensation, and it's evenly distributed over your whole body. And while all this is going on, you see images of situations with the person that you're breaking up with. And you hear voices. You play conversations, imaginary conversations or memories of conversations. You hear your voice, you hear the other person's voice, you plan saying certain things, and you hear your own voice trying to figure stuff out. Is it that person? Is it me? Should I do this? Should I do that? What's really going on here? So there is internal dialogue, internal imagery, And in addition to that, you may notice there's also some sort of background hum in your mind, a constant churning that you can't even clearly identify as images or words. Another kind of processing may be going in the background. All of this constitutes the thinking process. The planning, the judging, the fantasizing, the remembering, the believing, the wishing, the hoping comes in primarily words and images that occur internally. So as far as your subjective experience of this difficult emotion goes, it consists of certain qualities of feeling distributed in certain ways through the body, and it consists of thoughts, ideas in the mind. And although the thoughts may have as their content planning, judging, fantasizing, remembering, figuring out, etc., in terms of the way that the thoughts present themselves to you, they come primarily as a sequence of pictures in your mind, a sequence of sentences, words in your mind, and maybe some other kind of more subtle processing may or may not be present. So what I have just described to you are these subjective components of the difficult emotion. Part of it is in the feeling body, part of it is in the thinking mind. As opposed to the subjective side, there is the objective situation that has given rise to these subjective thoughts and feelings, and then there is the objective external expression of these thoughts and feelings. The external expression takes two forms. There is the external expression that shows what you are feeling. Maybe you cry. Maybe you raise your voice. Maybe you shake your fist. Maybe you hit something. These are external objective expressions of internal subjective feelings. And then there's another aspect of expression which is more purposeful. The actions you take, the words you speak, what you do to take care of this situation, if anything, is also something objective and external. So the basic components that we're dealing with are an external situation and the responses that one makes, either in terms of expressing one's internal state by facial gestures, sounds, or purposeful actions. And then there is the whole subjective side, what the mind and body goes through. The trick is to realize that we can't stop emotional feelings from arising within us, and for that matter, we can't stop thoughts from happening in response to the situations. But what we can do is reserve a certain amount of time and energy each time a difficult emotion comes up to develop a skillful relationship to those thoughts and feelings. Now, this can take two forms. We can either do it on the hoof, so to speak, while the thoughts and feelings are coming up, while we're responding to life situations. If we really have good skills, we can be working with those thoughts and feelings at the same time, just like you can drive the car and do something else at the same time. However, at the beginning, that is likely to be very difficult. So what we usually need to do in the early part of our training is just sit silently for a period of time and sit with the intention not to figure out what's going on, not to figure out what to do about it. We can do that at other times, but we decide to reserve a period of time, maybe 10 minutes, maybe an hour, maybe half a day, And we say, for this period of time, I'm not going to be concerned with figuring out what's going on. I'm not going to be concerned with figuring out what to do. But rather, I am going to cultivate the ability to have a complete experience of these thoughts and feelings. When we have a complete experience of the thoughts and feelings, we don't identify with the thoughts and feelings. They flow through us, but they're experienced not as a self, but as a releasing of spiritual blockages. So a complete experience of a difficult emotion is a true catharsis in the Greek sense of the word catharsis, which means a cleaning out. Now, usually people interpret catharsis to mean a complete external expression. If you make a complete external expression, if you are willing to really cry or really scream or really express yourself or really take appropriate action, that's catharsis. And a therapy that teaches you how to do that is cathartic therapy. But that's external expression. That in and of itself does not constitute permanent cleansing of consciousness. Unless there is an infusing of the thoughts and feelings with mindfulness, equanimity, and a cognizance of their impermanent nature, then no matter how dramatic our external display may be, it won't achieve very much in terms of permanent change. It won't get us any closer to experiencing our spiritual source in the midst of these difficult emotions. Most people affirm some sort of spiritual value, but as soon as there's even a little bit of anger, fear, sadness, embarrassment, frustration, it just goes away. It just vanishes. And it doesn't have to. In fact, the anger, fear, sadness, etc., represent one of the best possible opportunities to really cleanse consciousness, which culminates in the ability to experience those difficult emotions as none other than the effortless flow of nature. So, what do I mean by mindfulness? When I described the subjective flow of thought and feeling that constitutes the difficult emotion, in the example that I gave, I described it in tremendous detail. I talked about what's happening in the body in terms of qualities of sensation and their spatial distribution in the body. I talked about what's happening in the mind in terms of the types of thoughts that come up. Mindfulness means the ability to keep track of all of the components that constitute an experience while that experience is happening. Now, of course, mindfulness is one of these skills that has to be developed with practice so that you can keep track of all of these components and also do other things at the same time. As I say at the beginning, you may have to just go off by yourself in order to practice and develop the mindfulness. Eventually, you have a baseline of mindfulness. It allows you to keep specific contact with the components that constitute an experience. Equanimity means a non-interference with the natural movement of those components. The sadness flavor in the throat may shift and change moment by moment, get stronger, get weaker, spread, yank in. Your willingness to let it do that, to let it last as long or as short as it needs to, is equanimity. Likewise with each of the other flavors, and also with the thinking process. Your willingness to allow the thoughts to speed up or slow down, to allow the associational field of thought to spread or collapse, to allow the inner voice to get louder or softer without interference, is equanimity. Your ability to look through the mental images rather than at them, to listen to the internal voice as though it were just sound, rather than getting caught up moment by moment in its meanings. That's equanimity. And as one infuses mindfulness and equanimity into the thoughts and feelings that constitute the emotion, those thoughts and feelings begin to flow more easily. And that encourages one to infuse even more mindfulness and equanimity, and it sets up a kind of positive feedback loop, or we might even describe it as a virtuous cycle as opposed to a vicious cycle. In the virtuous cycle, we infuse mindfulness and equanimity, the experience becomes more fluid. That encourages us to infuse even more mindfulness and equanimity, and the experience becomes even more fluid as the result of that. At some point, even though the experience may be confusing to the mind and painful to the body, the confusion becomes fluid, and the discomfort, the uncomfortable flavors of anger, fear, sadness also become fluid. Ice and water are the same substance, but their behavior is very, very different. In the same way, anger, fear, and sadness could either be congealed, in which case they cause tremendous suffering, or they can be fluid, in which case they cause much less suffering and are rather experienced as a kind of releasing process. So when people talk about releasing painful emotions, as I say, they usually are implying some sort of full external expression of the painful emotion. But from a spiritual point of view, a release has to be something permanent, not a temporary blowing off of steam. And the real release takes place when you have so fully infused the flow of thoughts and feelings that you really see that it is a flow. And it seems like something is being taken away from you moment by moment. And what's being taken away from you are the thorns that have been embedded in the substance of your soul. And you experience this negative emotion as an internal cleansing. When you are able to do that, you may or may not externally express, depending on what? Depending on what's appropriate to the situation. In some situations, it's appropriate to give full, unblocked external expression. In other situations, it's not appropriate. But whenever there's an unblocked internal expression of feeling, that is to say, whenever you are in contact with the thoughts and feelings with mindfulness, equanimity, and you're aware of their impermanence, their moment-by-moment changing qualities. Whenever that happens, you are by definition having a complete internal expression. And that is always desirable. You can do an experiment for yourself to understand the nature of the emotions and the relationship of mindfulness to the emotions. If you know that you're going to encounter a challenging situation ahead of time, you're going to go into some situation where you may have some anger, some fear, some sadness, something come up, but it hasn't come up yet. You can do the following. Bring your awareness into your body and be aware of the different kinds of sensations that are there. And see if you have any sensations that you would suspect are associated with the emotions that may come up. There may be no such sensations, or there may be already the buds of these qualities. Then, as you move into the challenging situation, watch what happens to the body sensations. See if you can keep track of them. I had an interesting experience once doing this experiment. I was riding down the street and I noticed that in an empty lot near where I lived, they were running a carnival. And this is like a local barrio carnival. It's, not like a real high-tech type situation. And one always wonders how the safety is in these kinds of situations. But they had this like giant thing that was sort of like a Ferris wheel, except instead of having the usual seats that you sit in on a Ferris wheel, this had these bullet-shaped encased structures that hung and swung around. So that when they ran this Ferris wheel type thing, what happened is that you had two circular motions taking place, the large motion of the wheel and the small motion of each cage swinging around the perimeter of the wheel, giving an extremely disorienting perception, basically the perception being that you have just become disconnected, that the thing is broken apart and you're flying off into space at any given second. That's what your body is convinced is happening. So I thought, wow, this would be an interesting ride to play with, to explore the fear phenomenon. So what happens is that I first decide, okay, I'm going to do that. And I feel a little bit of just a very vague sort of pressure over my body, almost nothing, almost just so wispy that you're not even sure it's there at the initial decision to do this. Then, as I'm driving my car, getting closer and closer, I notice that a little more structure is appearing. It's all the fear flavor, but different aspects of the fear flavor are appearing in my abdomen, and then something in my arms, something in my head. And then as I arrive there and purchase the ticket to get on the ride, now I'm aware of about half dozen different locations acting up. Each one is changing in intensity with time, some changing rapidly, some changing slowly. And I'm also aware of how each one is spreading an influence through the body. Okay, so far so good. Now I get into the car, right? And the sensations are getting like much more intense, changing much more rapidly. In this particular case, it was all in the body. I didn't have any thoughts at all. It was all in the body, but they're getting much more rapid, much more intense, many more of them. But I'm keeping track of it all. Okay, no problem. And then the ride starts and I freak out. Suddenly, I am really scared and my mind is acting up. I just want to get the hell out of there and turn my awareness to my body. I can't feel anything. Well, I know damn well it's just full of sensations. But I've lost all my resolution power, all my contact. Took me about 5 minutes of self-talk. Get back and feel the body. You know it's there. It was getting more and more of it and more intense. That sequence has to have culminated not in it disappearing, but in it becoming so much that you lost track of it. So get back. Okay, feel what's in your gut, what's in your knee, what's in your head, what's here, what's there. After 5-10 minutes of talking to myself, once again, I can feel the body. And I start to feel a lot better. And then as soon as I establish contact with everything that was there, which was much more intense than before, but now I got it all in awareness, and I'm letting it expand and contract and vibrate and pull in and push out. No more suffering, no more freak out. Everything's just fine now. What does this experiment reveal? Well, I had mindfulness. Then suddenly I freaked out and I didn't have mindfulness. And you can do this experiment over and over again in daily life. And you'll find that whenever you quote freak out, by freak out I mean either suffer or act inappropriately, have distorted behavior, that just before you freak out, there is a dramatic drop in your mindfulness. Always. This is an empirical truth. Just before you lose it, just before you suffer, you lose contact with what is. And as I say, you can try this as an experiment if you know that you're going to go into a challenging situation. And if you do it over and over again, a certain empirical truth means an experimental truth, a scientific truth, will become evident to you. There are laws of nature, the laws of gravitation. It's a law. Well, there's a certain law in our human nature, and it is that suffering implies that you have lost mindfulness. Now, the implication of this is if you don't lose mindfulness, you won't suffer. It's dramatic. You're okay, you're in contact, you're in contact, you're in contact, you're okay, you're okay, you're okay. Suddenly you're not okay. And you look at, you're not in contact, you've lost the contact. So the contrapositive of that statement that suffering implies loss of mindfulness is no loss of mindfulness implies no suffering. That's a logical conclusion. And combined with the other empirical fact that mindfulness can be cultivated to any degree desirable. In other words, with practice, you can have mindfulness that can survive any complexity and intensity of emotion. So these two facts taken together mean that no one ever really has to suffer because of emotions. So this is what mindfulness is, keeping contact with the components.